everybody. Welcome. My name is Conlon, and I'm an author and contributor at The Prickly Pear. And today I want to talk about the phenomenon of people being fired. Obviously, I don't think we can move on from the assassination of Charlie Kirk, so I'll probably be talking about it from various different angles for a few weeks at least. But in any case, before I start sharing my opinions with you, I want to read a quote from Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities, which is his novel about the French Revolution. It's a really good book. I don't usually read novels, but anyways, the quote is this: "Vengeance and retribution require a long time. It is the rule." That's said by Madame Defarge, by the way. She's one of the villains. But I am feeling in a Defargian mood of late, just because I think this whole assassination, it's surprising. You wouldn't think after 10 years of Donald Trump, you wouldn't think there'd be anything more to reveal about the depravity of the left, but I will say the assassination of Charlie Kirk did reveal a new dimension to the depravity of the left, which is that apparently assassination is, among almost 50% of leftists, an acceptable method, an alternative method to resolving your political disputes. But anyways, if you've been paying attention in the aftermath of the Charlie Kirk assassination, you know that they've been characterizing people being fired, whether it's teachers or firefighters. I think that there were a few members of the military who were disciplined. They've been characterizing this as cancel culture. And I thought cancel culture referred to something specific, but in the era of social media where every word is just stripped of its context, apparently it's just come to mean consequences for your actions. Let me just start by saying that it kind of reminds me, there's a quote by William Buckley where he says, if you don't make these necessary distinctions, particularly with words. Actually, he didn't say this, I'm saying this. If you don't make these necessary distinctions with words and ideas, if you don't provide context, which is the most important aspect to communication, then you end up, and this is his quote, pretending that the man who pushes an old lady in front of a bus is the same as a man who pushes an old lady out of the path of the bus on the grounds that they're both pushing old women around. And this is kind of like, you can be stupid or silly and pretend and wonder what the difference is between, locking someone up for committing a rape and locking someone up for expressing an opinion online, because, oh gosh, oh gee, oh golly, they're both locking people up, and that's just... But that is so facile and so stupid, I don't even think we have to spend time. Just like when somebody says, well, what's the difference between firing people for exercising the basic right to medical integrity? Thousands of people were fired, if you remember, during COVID, because they made a decision not to inject themselves with an experimental technology. But what's the difference between that and firing people for celebrating capital murder? And it's asked as a serious question, as if we don't need any context whatsoever. Context just doesn't matter. The action abstracted from all of the circumstances is what matters. And that's just stupid. So I'm not even going to waste time on that. I'm just going to say this, that if you were wondering what a good definition for justice is, if you didn't want like a religious definition or a philosophical definition, if you just wanted like a simple, good, practical definition, my definition would be justice correlates good actions with good consequences, and it correlates evil actions with evil consequences. So the basic mandate of the state should be reward good, punish evil. And if you think about it, that's not crazy, because that's how any good parent raises their child, right? Like a child steals a cookie from the cookie jar, and then mommy asks Johnny, where'd the cookie go? And Johnny says, I don't know. Even though you can see the crumbs on his face and the stains on his shirt. And you can't, the good parent, if the child isn't honest or if the child steals, the good parent will punish the child not out of cruelty or vengeance or some sadistic impulse, but because a child needs to learn from an early age that good actions correlate to good consequences, and bad actions correlate to bad consequences. One of the reasons why there's so much delinquency and bad behavior among children is because they just raise themselves now, especially in big cities. Like, I can tell you, because I lived in a big city for several years. Kids just raise themselves. Their parents don't teach them the correlation between actions and consequences. And so what happens is that people's behavior devolves into a sort of game of, what can I get away with? But my basic point is that actions tend towards consequences. Like, an action without a consequence isn't even an action at all. Let me just say that. Actions are complete actions when they bring about consequences. And justice's job is to correlate good actions with the right consequences. That's why we say it's unjust if somebody is nice and somebody, he's engaged in the act of charitable giving and he gets slapped in the face, and people go, well, that's really unjust. Or if somebody's trying to do a good deed and he gets beat up for it, that's unjust. Well, why is that unjust? Because the wrong consequence has been correlated to the wrong action. That's what people mean. So the question is celebrating capital murder a wrong action, first of all? And secondly, if it is a wrong action, to what degree should a bad consequence be correlated with it? And here, I just want to say, by the way, it's not just the left who's hysterically claiming that this is some version of cancel culture. And let me just say about the left, they view immorality the same way they view morality, which is it's just an opportunity. So if you asked a truly proper leftist is concerned only about power, accruing power to the ideology, strengthening the position of the ideology. And so a proper leftist, if you asked a proper leftist, is morality good? They would say depends on the context. In normal circumstances, maybe, because morality may be the best strategy to maintaining power. Is immorality good? Well, it depends. In unusual circumstances, or maybe in all circumstances, who knows? But immorality is just another method. So the question of the left pretending that cancel culture is so terrible and censorship is so terrible, just remember that they're using morality as a method. They have no allegiance to it. It's not because they believe censorship is bad or firing people for expressing opinions is bad or cancel culture is bad. They're just using morality as a method. They think it is the best strategy at the moment to strengthen their own ideological position. So that's what that boils down to. But what's interesting is that there are certain conservative people, how do I say, influencers, podcasters, thinkers. The magnificent Ted Cruz, yes, that was ironic, was one of them. Tucker Carlson was another. But these are people who were warning against firing people for celebrating the assassination of Charlie Kirk because, this could backfire. And I thought, my God, they're right. I mean, imagine if this had gone on earlier. Imagine if during the first Trump administration, for example, he had engaged in mass censorship. Imagine if Donald Trump had set a bad example for Joe Biden to follow. Imagine that. And then Joe Biden might have felt he had permission to engage in mass censorship during COVID. He might have felt he had permission to engage in mass censorship during the 2020 election. Oh, but thank God Donald Trump didn't set a bad precedent. So we didn't experience any censorship because Joe Biden knew that the bad example hadn't been set. Yeah, right. These people don't need our permission to behave badly. You know, these conservatives, they're always so belated. They're always pretending like we're 20 years in the fucking past. Conservatives have been censored for decades. The notion that firing people for celebrating capital murder will suddenly implant in the mind of a leftist the idea of using social coercion to implement ideological uniformity? My God, the left never thought of that before. Oh no, the conservatives are setting a bad example. The left has been using social coercion for decades. So these people, at most, they just prove their stupidity and irrelevance. There's not even a grain of an insight there. If you're actually someone who objects to the firing of these people because you think it's going to set a bad example for leftism, you are a class A buffoon, and you shouldn't even have a social media account. You certainly shouldn't be in office. I guess intelligence went out the window, though, as a qualification for office a long time ago. But anyways, I've kind of gotten off track. Let me make a distinction here between criminal laws and social laws. Because criminal laws, and here's how I would describe it in a basic way. Criminal laws are enforced by the government against citizens, and criminal laws are formal. Oftentimes they're written down, they're codified. Social laws are informal, but still normative standards of behavior, and they're enforced by citizens against other citizens. So, for example, good manners are a form of observing social laws. They're not the only way, but this is largely the job of a parent. The job of a parent is to introduce and then educate their children into the social laws of the culture. And in fact, if people learn social laws early on, if their moral education is sound and it's good, and they learn that they learn, for example, you don't lie, you don't steal, you don't cheat, you don't use your fist to resolve differences, then they're probably not going to be subject to criminal laws in the future. So the more regularly and the more uniformly that people are taught and observe social laws, the less need there is for criminal laws in the first place. In order to reach a point in your society where there is widespread criminality, the social fabric has to disintegrate. Social laws have to break down in the first place. And what's happened these days is that the reason why our society is such a mess is because not only are criminals not held accountable, but there's no observance of social laws, whether they be small social laws or big social laws. You know, there's no understanding, for example, that when you're in a public space, you take up as little room as possible. You're not loud. You're not physically aggressive. You're polite to other people. All of those are social laws. And what used to happen is children were first taught social laws by their parents in the home, and then teachers reinforced that in schools. And then when they got to the workplace, everybody mutually had enforced it against everybody else. And then in public spaces as well. And so people were held to account by other people. That's disappeared. Nobody pays attention to anybody else now. Children are left to their own devices. They're raised by digital screens. More and more interaction is mediated by social media or YouTube. There's no chance to learn social laws. There's no opportunity for it. And the result of the matter is that people behave terribly in public. And that's what we saw in the wake of the Charlie Kirk assassination. We saw people who had never, ever been educated in basic, decent social behavior. For example, if you really rejoice in the death of an innocent man, keep it to yourself. That's something else you learn if you're well raised. You should always be careful about sharing anything that goes on in your head. But particularly if it's as distasteful as celebrating the death of an innocent man, if we lived in a society where people knew and observed social laws, they would have kept that to themselves. They might have told some of their closest friends. But no, they got on social media and they made videos about it. They decided it was important enough to publish to the world. That's the reaction they wanted to share with the world, was celebrating the death of an innocent human being. That's indecent socially. It's indecent on a human level. That's what happens when social laws disappear. So here's the reason why I don't have any problem with people being fired. Because I think in the wake of this assassination, it really did shock people. It really shocked people even more than the Trump election. It was so grotesque. It just caused this instinct in people. And they immediately wanted to hold people accountable for engaging in indecent behavior. It wasn't something they discussed beforehand. It wasn't a planned campaign. People didn't get together and say, we're going to fire him and her and her and him. It was just an instinct. People saw this really wicked thing going on, and they said, I want to be part of holding those people responsible. For the first time in decades, people said, I think we need to bring back social consequences. Not arbitrary social consequences, because that's what cancel culture really is. It's assigning social consequences arbitrarily based upon political differences. That's injustice. No. What happened was people said, we want to hold others responsible for doing something indecent on a basic human level. Had nothing to do with politics. Not essentially. And people said, I want to be part of correlating bad consequences to bad actions. I want to be part of that. So it was this reawakening almost of the social conscience. The idea that just because we aren't criminalizing speech, and speech shouldn't be criminalized by the government, but that doesn't mean that social laws cannot be used to humanize the public discourse, because they can, absolutely. And they absolutely should be. Because as I say, the more that social laws break down, actually, I have to say this, the government will often use the breakdown of social laws as an excuse to expand the purview of criminal laws. And this is why I say it's so important to hold each other to account. The parent holds the child to account. The friend holds the friend to account. The coworker holds the coworker to account. The people who share your spaces, the people who share your workspaces and your spaces of friendship and the spaces of public discourse, you absolutely have the right, you absolutely have the obligation to enforce some sort of shared framework of decent behavior. And anybody who tells you you don't have that right is probably a libertarian. And that is a good enough reason alone to hate them and despise them and never listen to them. I'm just kidding. Libertarians, man. They're like, let me just tell you why I dislike them. It's because they're like feminists and they mistake bad hygiene as a form of anti-establishment activism. And also, their solution is to abolish the state. You know, how brilliant is that? It's like somebody saying, let's get rid of war. That's awesome, man. Let's get rid of poverty. You know, when you're talking with somebody and their solution is to abolish some large and permanent reality like poverty or death or the state, you're not talking to a serious person. So that's all I have to say about libertarians. But anyways, let me just wrap this up. Let me just go back to the irony. I call it irony. I call it irony because you actually can't live in a society. You actually can't live in a culture where you can share spaces with others unless you have some sort of normative standard of behavior outside of criminal law. Because you know what? You don't want the government in every public space. But you know what? If social fabric breaks down, you're going to have the government in every public space. And the government is going to use the breakdown of the society as an excuse to say, well, we have to be in every public space because look at the chaos and look at the disorder. And naturally, there was the irony of conservatives who for years have been howling like chickens. Chickens don't howl. But whatever does howl, they've been howling about the corruption of teachers and how teachers, these people who have no moral recommendations at all, how they've been entrusted with forming our young minds, and that's just awful and wicked, and it's destroying the young people to be influenced by these perverse teachers. And you know what? You know what they're telling you now? You can't fire these teachers for celebrating capital murder. No, we have to leave these people in charge of caring for our young minds because huff, 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 puff, puff, puff. Free speech might be under attack if we fire them. Yeah, that's what they're telling you. That's what they're telling you with a straight face. And they're asking you not to laugh at them. These people are jokes. And we need to build a punchline around them. Because that's all these people are. They're jokes. And as I say, they're so belated. They always come to the present 20 years in the future. And what I mean by that is they're still pretending we're living in a world where somehow we didn't live through the Biden administration. They're still pretending we live in a world where conservatives weren't mass censored and people weren't fired for their jobs. And teachers weren't fired and military members weren't fired. So I can just see it, just General Carlson with his microphone lifted high and an army of conservatives. And in the heart of every conservative, there's the same soaring thought. They're going to meet an army of people with bolt-action rifles, and they're talking about free speech. There was somebody who believed in free speech, and he was killed in front of his wife and his children precisely for what he believed in. And allow me to say that if your reaction to the assassination of a free speech icon is, we have to recommit to free speech, you are stupider than the sole of my shoe. You are so stupid. You have failed to understand the moment in such a catastrophic way. It cannot be put into words. Whatever we have to do, it's more than just recommit to free speech. It's more than just recommitting to free speech, because Charlie Kirk did that every day, and he was executed on live TV for it. So the people talking about how we can't implement social consequences, sometimes I wonder if those people aren't libertarian, because if they are, you know why they think that. But if they aren't, I just wonder, do they even believe in civilization? Or are they just spouting platitudes? Like, that's the Tucker Carlson thing. He's an honest person, but he's such a simpleton. He really is. He's just such a simple person. He's such a platitude monger. His takes they lack profundity. So I don't think we should too eagerly defend these people who are celebrating capital murder. I don't think we should rush to their defense. I don't think we should enthusiastically rationalize the position of these people. And let me just say this about Tucker Carlson had an episode on free speech, and I actually agreed with a lot of what he was saying about government censorship, and that was the focus of it. I just use Carlson as a foil because he is who he is, but I really do think the idea that people shouldn't be fired for celebrating capital murder, I do think that's the take of a simpleton. And I do think it is a completely cliched understanding of what free speech is and what free speech constitutes. And let me end by saying this, that self-government, before it can be a political system, it has to be the practice of numerous individuals. So if you're going to have a country that truly operates under self-government, that only happens once a sufficient number of the individuals are practicing self-government on an individual level. And one of the ways that we self-govern, literally the people govern each other, is through social laws and social consequences. And that's the whole point. Ultimately, the truth matters here. There is a difference between pushing an old lady in front of a bus and pushing her out of the path of a bus. There is a difference. It's not just pushing an old lady around. Firing someone for merely expressing a mainstream political view or even a fringe political view. Firing someone for exercising medical integrity. Firing someone because they spoke out against an institutional orthodoxy. That is not the same as firing someone for celebrating capital murder. Except to the extent that you want to call the celebration of capital murder a fringe political view. But again, that's such a vague phrase, you know? Yes, imagine somebody who has a job, and one day he marches through a Jewish neighborhood waving a Nazi flag and screaming, "Hitler had it right." The Supreme Court has ruled that that person cannot be arrested. And I don't think we want that person to be arrested. But if that person shows up to work on Monday and his boss says, "This business," and a business is really just a community of citizens. That's what an American business is. If that business says, "We don't want you here anymore," there's nothing wrong with that. That's not government coercion. That's not censorship in the way that Tucker Carlson means censorship. That's self-government. That's citizens enforcing standards of human decency against other citizens. So the truth matters here. And I just want people to remember that if we don't get back to a place in this country where social laws are regularly observed by a sufficient number of people, we're already screwed. We're already lost. You should already be preparing to live under an authoritarian government. That's what social laws are there to prevent. The massive expansion of criminal laws. So in any case, let me say it again, those people deserve to be fired. Those people deserve to be fired. Those people definitely who celebrated Kirk's death deserve to be fired. Thanks for watching.